Okay. Tim, would you like to get this meeting kicked off?
Yeah, sure. Hello, this is Tim Nickel, DOTD. We've met a few months ago. This is workshop number 3. We're going to be looking at some of the potential joint uses or input for joint uses under the or along the alignment or under the alignment or what have you. And we look forward to getting input from you and some ideas and considerations. So with that, please proceed.
Thank you, Tim. I think most of you have already been on some of these calls before. We're going to run the calls similar to what we've done in the past for the first meeting of the set. So everyone right now, except the presenters, will be on mute. What we're going to do is go through some chunks of the presentation with some Q&As in between. Please use the chat feature like we've done in the past to put any questions that you'd like to ask the team in the chat. And when we get to the Q&A section, I'll read off the questions as they've come in, and we'll unmute you so you can have conversation with the team to help answer your question appropriately and properly. We're going to try to stick to under structure use conversation. I know that there's a lot of people with a lot of ideas, so we just want to hear out as much as we can. So we're going to keep the chat moving and keep us on time. It's a 2-hour meeting, so we definitely want to be out of here by 6. This meeting is recorded, and it will be provided tomorrow on the Connector website, LafayetteConnector.com, but you will get an email with all of that information. Other than that, I believe, Derek, we can start.
Great, thank you. I think we're going to start by introducing the speakers that you're going to hear from tonight. And I'll start with myself since I've already started talking. My name is Derek Chisholm. I'm an urban planner and designer, member of the Institute of Certified Planners, and maintain some LEED vision credentials in sustainable design. I've been on the project for a long time, largely in a support role. I'm going to be moving into an expanded role with Task 6 and helping it move along, and I'm eager for that. I've got a background in context-sensitive work, and I've worked on a number of large NEPA projects, large bridges where understructure joint uses were a big topic, a lot of it in the Pacific Northwest. Worked a bit recently on the Gordie Howe between Windsor and Detroit on sustainable design issues, a couple of big large bridges in Portland and in Seattle for the Alaska Way Viaduct and Waterfront Promenade. And then lastly, for the relocation of the Portland Saturday Market. All these were understructured joint use kind of conversations, similar to the one we'll have tonight. And so, that's part of my background, but I think maybe more importantly is that, I've got roots there, ties there, half Cajun, you could say maybe. My grandmother was born in Bro and grew up in Lafayette. And I visited her there and in Karen Crow. I can remember talking to her on the phone when she only spoke French until her second marriage. So I go way back there. It's a delight to be in the community now and attempting to do what I can to contribute in some small way. Anthony and Jimena are also going to be presenting some slides tonight.
Hello, I am
Jimena.
Yeah, hi, I am Jimena Atterbury, and I am a senior urban planner. I am part of the context-sensitive solutions team, task team, and I will be presenting and showing you some international and national examples for understructure uses.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Anthony Belomo, and I'm also on the Context Sensitive Solutions, or CSS, as we like to call it, team with Jimena and Derek. And I'll be part of the presentation tonight. And I'm a senior landscape architect with Stantec, which is one of the consultants working on the design team, and also have a lot of experience with corridors that are large transportation corridors, but also urban design and neighborhood connectivity projects. So those are all components that, we'll probably get into during tonight's discussion.
Great, thank you. What tonight's discussion will include is roughly framed out in this agenda here. We'll give you some background, talk about the process a little bit, pause at the end of that for any questions related there too. And then my colleague Jimena will be going through some international and national examples, some of which you've seen before, some of which are new. And then we want to add some Louisiana examples to this because we really thought it was important for y'all to be able to go and stand under structures and experience other spaces and see what it feels like, sounds like, looks like, smells like. And these will give the opportunity to do so. My colleague Anthony will be talking about the issues to consider, as well as some of the ideas to consider. I'm eager to get to that part of the presentation. It'll be very exciting. But maybe more importantly than the tidbits of the agenda is the objective here and what we're trying to do tonight. The potential uses, there are so many comparable sites, and we're going to walk you through a lot of those. You've seen some of those already. We're going to walk you through some more. And there's so many things that are transferable. We want to give you some exposure to that and give you some more of the details associated therewith, focusing on cost, which is one of the most important parameters that'll guide our work. We'll also talk about just and weave in some of the things that have been previously discussed, mining from adopted plan documents that the community has already developed, as well as previous conversations we've held. But where all of this is going is to an increasingly more refined range of options, right? We'll start, and we have started, in previous years, with a smorgasbord of opportunities, right? But we need to get more and more refined about what it is that the community needs and is willing to support, where those go, and slowly moving to being able to spatially arrange those and develop a program for the management of those pieces. So this is a really significant milestone, I think, where we turn from that loose talk, looking at the menu thing, to actually starting to put our concept together. Very important night tonight. Why are we discussing all this? Well, because there's about to be 3.5 miles of elevated structure with a lot of space available, right? And it's going to be in the heart of the community. We all know how important this is and how much it can affect change in the community. Without a specific program like this one to approach the aesthetics and the use of these spaces, they're largely left blank, as you can see here. Now, the DOTD is not going to leave you an eyesore. They're not going to leave something ungraded. It would be paved or grassed or what have you, but there's so much more that we can do, right? And so that's what we want to do tonight, is to start to get more refined input about exactly what y'all want and where you might want that, or at least start that percolating in your heads. So then over the holidays, you speak with family and friends and colleagues, constituents, peers, and you're pulling together their opinions, come back in January and really tell us in greater detail what y'all are after, so that we can get to work on trying to help make that happen. We're hoping that y'all think of this as a grand opportunity. All this ground level right away, a large portion of it under the structure. If I was to come to you as an individual or come to your organization and say, I've got an acre of land in the urban core, and I'm going to cover it for you, and you can do whatever you want underneath, right? That would be very exciting, I think, for many of your organizations, individuals, many of your neighborhoods, right? Well, scale that up dozens of times to what we're talking about here and the level of opportunities here. So what we really want is for y'all to start, through this meeting and the one we have at the beginning of January, start to identify what is desired and help us get a sense of the arrangements of those in more important spaces, less important spaces, both on uses and on the aesthetics and the design of the project. As we get more of those identified, we'll then be having conversations with neighborhood groups. We're trying to put those together now. COVID doesn't make it easy, but we're still trying to work directly with some neighborhoods, and the ideas you bring to us, we bring to them, right? That will continue to develop and refine until we bring those to large, open public meetings where anyone can come, and eventually moving towards recommendations to the executive committee and then selections in a preferred alternative. Very exciting turn, I think, in the project right now. So let me stop there for a minute and see. I don't see anything in the chat, and if there's not, I'll just keep rolling on because it's closely related to the background. But stop me if there's general process things, or put something in chat, and we'll see it there. So we figured it was important to touch on where we've been. Many of y'all have been slogging through this with us, so you remember these different activities. You know, we came together years ago thinking we had a short environmental reevaluation and some CSS conversations to have, and instead what y'all told us was, no, build a completely different highway. So you know, the interchange footprints have been greatly reduced. The project changed a great deal. That took some time to work through, figure out. And essentially, we're still in that phase of figuring it out. The designs continue to evolve, then we analyze it in traffic, then we go back and try something else with design. So we're working through that while we have these conversations. This organization, this advisory group was formed in 2019, and we were getting up a good head of steam to run into the rest of the conversations when COVID hit. And like most folks, we weren't sure how long that would last at first, so we just sort of held off on things. Turned out it wasn't going to be something we could shake off easily. And so we pivoted to virtual engagements rather than putting off the project for a long period of time. So I appreciate all of your efforts to deal with your own Zoom craziness and whatever it took you to get on the meeting tonight and in previous times, but it's helping us to move forward, right? This is the third of 3 of these workshops. We'll move from this, like I said, into those neighborhood conversations, into full public open houses, and from there moving towards a preferred alternative, which, as you might guess, is going to clarify all sorts of lane configurations and signals and such, but it's also going to clarify some of at least the conceptual elements associated with understructure and joint uses. So in case you missed the last episodes of the show, episode number 1 was on structures, right? We talked about bridge types. You got an earful of information about constructability and costs and how these weather. The bridge team put together a presentation of pier types, and they started the conversation on style too. We had a conversation about whether or not the community is looking to embrace a contemporary style, early modern, classic approach to things. There was some talk about Art Deco. Those are all conversations that are interwoven with today's conversation as well. Workshop number 2 focused on signature features and elements of a superstructure that could make it more aesthetically appealing. We talked about some span length options, and also started to play with concepts for gateways on the main line. We recognize that there's a very important conversation about neighborhood gateways at a different scale, and that's yet to come. That's part of these upcoming workshops. So as you know, we've been having this conversation for some time, and there's some good records. So we have a comment management system and can sift through those and see what's been discussed before. We've pulled some of those data, and you can see some of those ideas here. Many things that we've heard over the years, we are still hearing, right? Connection is very important for a lot of folks. We hear it come up many ways, and we're talking about physical connections, right? That making sure the roadways go through, that the urban grid is as complete as practical, making sure the sidewalk and pedestrian and cycle facilities are also connecting. But I think that I hear another piece in the connection too, which is using it as a gathering space, using it as an attractive place for people to interact, which really brings neighborhoods together and helps heal the divide. You know, we've heard a lot about the divide and healing it and solving it and fixing it. And so there's physical connections and there's the gathering of communities, both of which are very important. We've also gotten input on art space and specific ways that the art could really help. And there's a little sub committee of folks who will be advancing that. Landscaping, stormwater management. We've heard lots of things over time, and we'll continue to collect those input through events like these, big public events, and the online data portal or comment portal. But we'd be remiss to not pick up on what you all have figured out without us in the room, of course, which is manifest in many of your planned documents. Some a bit more dated, some more recent activities associated with this project or the Tiger grant funded ETRT process. And similarly emphasizing in these comments, we heard things about connections, conversations about bike and pedestrian facilities, gateways, et cetera. We've got more extensive. This is just one little slide. We've really digested some of this. I like a couple of these images at the bottom that help get the juices flowing. A farmer's market depicted from the Blue Book. And then the other side, the other image is actually an enclosed space under the structure where nobody would get to access it, and it's walled off with art on it instead. And they emphasize the adjacent corridor of sort of new urbanist development instead. Very interesting concepts that have been in consideration as we've moved forward. So I'm going to turn it over to Jimena, who's going to walk you through some international examples, and I'll just progress the slides on mute.
All right. Hi, everyone. I will be showing you some international examples first and then national examples. We selected these examples because we thought that seemed to be comparable or applicable to this project and to Lafayette. Keep in mind that these are just ideas of what other cities have done to take advantage of these and also activate the unused or underutilized spaces underneath the overpasses. So next, start with the first one. This one is Underpass Park in Toronto, Canada. This is an active public park. It covers approximately 2.7 acres. And it has recreation space such as playgrounds, basketball courts. It also has a skate park. It also includes flexible community space and public art, which you see featured there on the top image, featuring the octagonal reflective stainless steel surfaces. Next. This image is what it was before, and then the one below it is a visualization of ideas for the programming of the space. Next. These are current images of the park. As you can see, playground for kids, basketball courts, the skate park, and the bottom right-hand photo shows artwork that was commissioned for the columns in response to a tagging problem they had. Next. Here we have the Bentway in Canada as well. This is a mile-long active park with space for seasonal recreation. In that I mean they have a skating rink and an ice skating rink. They have performance spaces, space for fitness classes, of various types, festivals, and also art is a big component of this. Next, Seart Park, located in New Zealand. As you can see, the main design element here are the vertical, vibrant painted steel poles that bring energy and life to an otherwise dark and dull space, usually characteristic of these underneath the structures. This is an example of how to visually animate the space that is not highly programmed. And there's more images in the next slide. No, go back. Here are more images of the slide of the Seart Park, sorry. A night shot of it on the bottom. Next. Here we have the Lego Bridge in Germany and another art installation in Scotland. These are two additional examples of how to create interest and vibrancy underneath an overpass with color and public art and just playfulness, making the space more inviting and contributing to that sense of safety. Next. And the last international example is a formal railroad viaduct. This one shows an example, or gives you an example of how the understructure can also be utilized for commercial uses, such as cafes or maybe art galleries or small shops. Next, we're going into some national examples. First one is the State Route 54 and Duck Creek Bridge. This is in Wisconsin. This is a state DoD project that made the bridge more pedestrian friendly. And also the design of this preserved environmentally and culturally sensitive areas. It incorporated public art, as you see in the columns, and also has some sort of storm management component to it. Next, this is Burnside Skate Park in Oregon, Portland, Oregon, highly popular skate park. This skate park actually started as a small DIY project by local skaters, and it got bigger with more ramps and obstacles, all done mainly through donations. Next, this is a photo of it today, and as it is evident in this photo, graffiti is part of the skating culture, but there are ways to make it a little more appealing, and I'll show you in other slides coming up. Next, this is a Manchester Stormwater Park located in Washington. It's about ½ an acre. And although this is not it's not located under an overpass, it does showcase an example of a stormwater treatment site that's also a park, and that is walkable and bikeable and an amenity to the community. So we did hear some stormwater needs for Lafayette, so maybe this could be an idea. Next, this is the Jose Marti Park in Miami, Florida. Although not all of the park is underneath a structure, some of it does span underneath the I-95, and it's a mix of both green space and hardscape with active and passive recreation and passive and active recreational uses. This is the Underline, also in Miami, Florida. This is a park that hasn't been completed yet. I believe the first phase has been completed, but it is part of this is a 10-mile linear park located under the Miami's Metro Rail. And between public and private donors, they repurposed this unused land and converted it into a public park, a community asset, and space for gathering. The first phase has walking paths, it has flexible basketball and soccer courts, an outdoor gym, and a butterfly garden, as well as small gathering spaces. Next, this is the 14th Street Viaduct in Hoboken, New Jersey. It is the programming of this covers about 4 blocks. And the space underneath includes space for events such as flea markets, movies, outdoor movies, farmers market, multi-recreational space for basketball, children's playgrounds. It also has a dog park, and I believe also space for roller and ice hockey. Next, these are images nighttime at the same space. And here you can see how important lighting is to the spaces underneath. They serve to make the community, be able to use this space, but also make them feel safe. And it can also be part of an art component. And here you've used LED lighting in various colors to just animate the space more. And this is an image of what the viaduct looks like today. It's very well maintained, as you can see. This is the Route 21 freeway. This park is really just highlights the connectivity aspect of the neighborhood. There are 2 neighborhood parks that help integrate this freeway structure into the community by connecting the freeway, the space under the freeway with paths and gathering spaces for both the communities on both sides. And here is a shot of a plan view of that space. It's not highly programmable, but it is still highly used and effective in connecting both neighborhoods. Next. Next. Here we go. This is the Alexander Hamilton Bridge. The space underneath was, they created a skate park underneath, and on the bottom left-hand corner, you can see a skate park rendering of the space. It has walkways, multi-use pathways. Next. This is a photo of it today. The one thing I wanted to point out here is that although graffiti is very much part of the skating culture, it might look unsightly to some, but this is what the skaters like. So as an idea and just an idea of what to do with this, proactively do with this is, how about commission a professional graffiti artist or a local muralist instead of having amateurs take care of the space. So just an idea to keep in mind. Next, this is Route 98 West Ames Park, part of the Battery City community in New York City. This showcases a linear park with an area comparable to the understructure area. You can see some of the amenities here in the photographs. It includes a playground, half basketball courts. It even has some, I believe, gardens at the east end of it. And also has a dog run and a very prominent bike path. Next, these 2 areas underneath the I-65 in Louisville, Kentucky, and La Marqueta Queensburger Borough Bridge in New York City are both great examples of understructure spaces that are not programmed, but are still used in many flexible ways with different types of events, such as music events, farmers markets, food trucks, festivals. So these are just ideas of, what you can do with that space, that you don't have to really program it all out in order for it to be successful. Next. Here we have the Buffalo Bay Promenade in Texas and the Amtrak station area in Alabama. These show how important of a role lighting really is to these spaces, not only to make people feel safe, but they can also contribute to the art, to making the space more inviting, visually more interesting. So there are many opportunities in which lighting can be applied to these spaces underneath. And then finally, we have this flea market in Wallace, Idaho, very popular with the community. It's underneath Interstate 90. The flea market is one of the more popular events that require little programming. But they can also hold food booths, arts and crafts. And one of the advantages to all these understructure areas is that events can happen whether you have bad weather or not. So that's just something to point out. And with that, I will let Derek show you some Louisiana examples.
We want to take a break for a second and answer some questions in chat. Do you mind? Okay. Let's see. There's a question from Charles Bull. Does current DOTD policy allow business to operate within interstate highway right-of-ways? I'll go ahead and unmute you in a second, Charles. There we go.
It's complicated. I'm a consultant. I don't work at DOTD, so they may want to chime in on this, but it's complicated. I think the answer is at least yes, generally speaking, right? There is a joint use process where different entities, it's local government or commercial entities could lease space from the DOTD. We showed the example in Paris, which is an entirely enclosed built environment under the elevated structure, which is, that would be an innovative and very complex undertaking. I think what is a little bit more foreseeable is, like we saw in La Marqueta, which was food trucks, right? And people enjoying the space and being able to eat, but it's a lot more interim. Someone else may want to chime in with more detail, but the answer is yes, given lots of criteria and consideration, of course.
I think the only thing that I'd want to add to that is now that we've seen some international examples and some national examples, and our next phase in tonight's presentation will be to look at some local examples. The idea behind why we're showing all these precedents isn't so much to say what works in Houston, Texas, or what works in Idaho, or what has been done in Miami is exactly applicable to Lafayette. But the idea is we wanted to pull a whole variety of things together that would just kind of get the conversation going about ways that we can start to have a dialogue about the uses under the structure that are maybe outside of the box. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be absolute parallels, but what I think we're trying to do with showing precedents, which is a logical place to begin. We haven't designed anything. There haven't been any decisions made about what should be under this corridor. So the first logical step is to look at precedents. And I think what that helps to do is it initiates a dialogue about what are some of the ways that we could make the under structure use interesting, accessible, exciting, aesthetically pleasing, with all the other things in mind that people are concerned about. And so I just wanted to kind of say that as an overview of everything we're showing you. It's really just to kind of whet your appetite, for lack of a better term, to get the conversation going.
Thanks, Anthony.
Well, thank you for that. I just want to add that the reason I asked the question was mainly less about not appreciating the visual, but more as to giving us some bumpers as to what's outside of possibility for this particular project. So as we're brainstorming, we know what we are going to be able to do.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Good.
Okay, we have another question from Samuel Oliver. For DOTD, do underlighting and art fall under enhancements, which are the local authority's financial responsibility? We'll go with that one first. And let me unmute you, Sam.
Yeah, I mean, as previous sessions have outlined, when we talk about this process, when we're identifying what we think is an optimal situation for any one of these elements, sometimes it's considered an enhancement, sometimes it's considered not. And typically those enhancements are considered part of the, it would be Lafayette's responsibility to pay for, which I just bring up because that's an ongoing issue we're having right now in our city. So I'm just curious where this really falls in terms of the project.
Yeah, and I think again, it's a complex question to answer at this earlier stage, but I think what is logical is once we kind of start to generate a vision for what will be ultimately design guidelines. So I mean, to take a step back, and I am going to answer the question, but to take a step back, the whole point of these design workshops is really for input. We want to hear from both the committee and others so that we as design professionals can do our job the best way possible. And the only way we can do that job for you is to hear from you. And so these sessions are going to help us begin to frame design guidelines, because at the end of the day, when the project, this phase of the project wraps, there will be a design guideline document that's generated, right? And so I think when we get to that phase, which there will be opportunities for public input as that component gets developed, some of these questions you're asking now will be easier to answer because we'll have more concrete and specific recommendations that are more definable in terms of, are these payable by the state, or are these payable by the municipality? And in some instances, it's actually a hybrid where the initial installation could potentially be payable by the project, but then it's the ongoing maintenance, let's say for lighting, for example, that then gets transferred over to the municipality. But to be able to answer that in a concrete way now would be tricky because we don't exactly yet know what it is that would be proposed. But it may very much be a hybrid or, depending on the decisions that get made.
This is Tim Nickel. Look, on regular projects, I've seen where, lighting we may have used federal funds for lighting, and I don't know of a single situation where we didn't have, we've always required the local entity to O&M the lighting on the projects I've dealt with in the past. Typically things like art would typically be, something a local entity would have to, take care of. But I can say that lighting I've seen where we've used certain federal funds for on projects, and the local entity agreed to do the operation and maintenance of the lighting.
I mean, that makes sense to me. I guess, when it comes to a design element for a project, you can design somebody $1 million house and show it to them, and then they can say, well, we were really looking to build a house for $150,000. So, I don't want us to do that.
Yep, that's fair. I think this conversation will be exploring those gray areas where, you can imagine the DOTD is not going to leave a completely dark passage along a road underneath there, right? Nor would they leave a completely blank column unless you ask for completely blank columns, right? There would always be some modicum of lighting, finished treatments, and we talked about that when we talked about the different pier set column types and such. But at the same time, DOTD is not going to put in a light show for you. Paying for that. We know that they would pay for this, and there's this enormous gray area in between, which as as Anthony was saying, as the ideas develop and we can fit them into the regulatory and financing construct, then we'll have more certain answers. And as you bring us more specific proposals, we can really start to parse those apart. We knew this would be a big topic, and so Anthony's got a slide later that actually takes a real live project like this now in the state and separates out what FHWA will take care of, because it's really their decision more than it is Tim's in some ways, what FHWA will take care of and what they will not. So we will get to that tonight.
And do you want to take the next question? Will the CSS include a survey of existing community and neighborhood activity?
So just to clarify, Sam, when you ask survey, you're essentially meaning like an overview, an assessment, existing conditions kind of thing. Is that what you mean by survey?
Yeah, it could actually be, going out and asking residents and observing. It could be, a written survey. But I guess my question is part of this not just to observe international and statewide communities and what's done in other places and where farmers markets have worked and not, et cetera, but also what is the actual ongoing, community activity in the areas adjacent to and that will be impacted by this project. and how it could be potentially incorporated into the project or complemented or supported by it?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And while there isn't like a formal market research component to our scope, what we are doing is kind of like, you know, on the ground, but albeit remotely, we're reaching out to several area stakeholders and key community groups, but we also have meetings planned for the future with individual neighborhoods. And there are public meetings as well on the docket as we advance. And the whole point of that is to do just what I think you're suggesting, assess what does the community have now? And if I might, like as planners and landscape architects, I mean, that's a level of analysis that is fundamental to what we do. I mean, it's really impossible to develop design guidelines or recommendations, which ultimately will come out of this process without adequate analysis. And so we are looking at the existing neighborhood frameworks, connectivity, the street grid, where various, you know, facilities are located. You know, we don't want to duplicate facilities. So for example, if there were a community group that was already advocating for, let's say, a skate park, just as an example, somewhere else, we certainly don't want to compete with that. And so that would make it very clear to us, there's no logic in proposing something like that programmatic use under the structure. And if there are existing public parks or public open space in the community that are currently underfunded, it wouldn't make sense to be proposing a lot of new park space under the overpass that might siphon capital funds away from existing facilities. So I think all of that analysis and focus on existing conditions and existing uses in and around the community are essential to this process and part of what we'll do as we go.
So the answer is yes.
Yes. I always use 35 words when 5 will do.
Appreciate it.
I think we have time for, I don't want to put anybody off with questions, so I think we'll go ahead and answer Matthew's question, and then we can move on because we skipped our first Q&A. So has the LCP made a decision on the height of the structure? This seems like it could have a great effect on understructure uses and making the space more or less inviting.
Well, I hope Tim can help us with that one. I'd like to hear his input. Again, the short answer, I'll try to stick to 5 words, as Anthony said, is no, LCP is not deciding anything. It was decided a while ago that you wouldn't get the bare minimum, but exactly how high it is in different locations, still getting worked on. Tim probably knows more than I do. He's much closer to that piece.
Yeah, I believe the original ROD had a commitment of having higher structures. And based on the original ROD, the additional height was around 22 feet. And so that's what we currently are showing in our details. So that's, you know, we won't have a final decision until we have an approved ROD, but right now what we're showing in our alternatives are about a 22-foot clearance. But I mean, we're, you know, again, if somebody says, could you make it 25 feet because of whatever reason? Could you make it 18 feet because of some other reason? We're still taking input. But right now, the alternatives we're showing are about 22 feet.
Okay, thank you, Tim.
Can I chime in for a second? Can you guys hear me? I can't tell. So this is something that we've discussed in previous workshops. I know you guys are probably tired of hearing it, but I think that, you know, I've definitely pointed this out, and I think I'm not the only one that I think that 22 feet is not high enough, and we'll come back to something we were saying that Jimena was saying about like this kind of dark and dreariness of the understructure, and you know that a lot of that is kind of reduced as you build higher and you let more light in. So it makes it more inviting. It makes it like more likely that you're going to get like community activity under the spaces. So just I'm kind of like curious on what the thought process is there, if there's a possibility of increasing from that 22 foot commitment that's in the rod, and like what is the range that you guys are considering in terms of height?
Well, I think we're considering everything, but then you have impacts to higher, because we have some people that don't want it higher. They don't want that visual impact. Some people may want it a little lower. So, and so we gather that input and make note of it. And what we have currently right now shown is 22 feet, which is above our typical height.
So are there people that have actually said that they don't want it higher or that they want it lower? Because the only times that we've discussed the height and this group, most people have been saying that it's too low, just from what I've noticed.
No, I believe we've had people in some of the neighborhoods that have concerns about the visual impact of having this tremendously high structure that, could potentially start becoming, going above the tree line and what have you. It becomes more of a visual impact further out you go.
That's right, Tim. We have heard that. And there are some other challenges. It changes the noise impacts in some ways that you could imagine, in some ways that are sort of counterintuitive. Also, ramps have to get longer, so you get longer stretches of the spaghetti connections that some folks don't want to see and will impede some access to the structure. But, but we've also heard what you're saying, Matthew, and from numerous people, of course, that the understructure space is going to be greatly affected by how high this is, and the noise level and the lighting and the ability to get natural light in there and those sorts of things.
Okay, Derek, do you want to move us into your next section?
Sure. I'm going to start us off in Shreveport. And it's a little bit of a haul, but not so bad. You take a holiday trip up there, and you get to experience the Red River District. So as it approaches the Red River, it gets higher. This is a good bit higher than 22. It's difficult to see, and I'm hoping some of y'all are making notes to be able to look at these spaces online and read comments about them and such. This one's difficult to see on Google Maps or Google Earth. You have to go to Clyde Fant Parkway and look up the corridor, or just go there in person, right? So this space is really effective. It's a retrofit that was done under US 71. And you can see commercial entities lining both sides. Those have minimal traditional characteristics, but it's new construction, right? And what they do is they use the space under the structure, not to program, not to put the businesses, but to enhance the businesses, right? So the adjacent businesses have this extra space out in front of them. And a lot of those businesses are nightclubs. Lafayette has wrestled with, nightclubs and the raucous nature of that land use, right? It's not always consistent with little galleries and cool coffee shops, right? And so, in Shreveport, some of the more raucous late night nightclub stuff is right here. And it's sort of cordoned off in a way, and it has some advantages, right? People can spill out of the clubs and check their phone or smoke a cigarette, whatever, all in this plaza space out here in the middle, right? So it really helps those surrounding businesses. And it's also one of those conditions where you park once and enjoy the evening, and so intoxicated people aren't driving between different bars and that sort of thing. It's pretty effective in some different ways, though the site, it's not perfect, of course. Here are some additional images of it. You can see the landscaping at the bottom of the bents. You can see some of the commercial entities on both sides that really are maximizing this whole space. And then at times there will also be festivals where vendors and musicians are actually underneath the structure. And that is the focus of it, right? And then of course the adjacent retail and stuff is really benefiting from all those feet that they bring there. Some of the downsides here, some of the applicability I think is interesting. They do use tax increment financing to keep some of the improvements maintained in this area, which is a clever and useful approach. But it's also not got a lot of different ways in and out. And so I've, heard professionals assess the safety feeling, right? That you can't just leave this space. There's only so many ways in and out, which is something you don't want to create. So very interesting site, not a long drive. It's worth a quick visit. I'd also say in Shreveport, one of the unique things is its juxtaposition compared to downtown. It's to the side of downtown, not, there's some casinos nearby, but with some parallels to Lafayette, it's not like right in the center. And so, there's a lot of thinking to be done about how it stitches to the downtown and what happens with the interim space. Does downtown expand to the understructure uses? Is there a little bit of a gap in between, et cetera? All right, so that's a very ambitious undertaking that included incentivizing economic development, job creation, big undertaking. This is something a little bit more modest, right? And it's not an attempt to bring festivals underneath here. It's not an attempt to have people hang out under here. It was just an uncomfortable crossing. It wasn't safe. Safety is paramount to the DOTD. It wasn't attractive. People didn't want to go under here. And so this is pretty much an aesthetics-based improvement that really, enables it to feel safe, brings the folks through. And so inadvertently, then people do walk through. And then as others are walking through, you're more likely to walk through because it doesn't look abandoned and scary and like a predatory environment, right? So a singular aesthetic improvement that ended up having sort of those benefits of bringing people to it. And a recent undertaking too. Skate parks are very popular. So here's another example of a skate park. We want to bring this one up because you can actually visit it. You can bring your skateboard and go skating or just visit it otherwise, right? For those of us who can't stand up on a skateboard. Interesting site because it wasn't originally part of some programmed undertaking like this one, right? So, FHWA and the DOTD's commitment to this CSS process is pretty unique. Highways didn't get used to be built this way, and these things sometimes were developed far afterwards, and that's the case here. A local grassroots group pretty much put the idea together and gathered up the funding and kept it moving forward. No DOTD, no city funds involved. One of the reasons skate parks sort of work in these contexts is because if it's already a noisy environment, skating is kind of a noisy thing too. And so both are sort of compatible in that manner. Obviously, as we entertain the maintenance and management of these areas over a long period of time, that is very important to consider. You can imagine the Red River District, it is its own financial sub-district of the downtown. It is a serious management undertaking. A skate park is much less of a serious undertaking, but you can still see that, there's some maintenance issues and things that might occur over time. And especially with a nonprofit being in charge of the operations and maintenance, it can be even trickier over, a 10, 20-year period, of course. Here's an interesting example where, in a sense, they put the things they didn't want to see together instead of the things that they did want to see. So in New Orleans, a Convention Center Boulevard runs in front of, you guessed it, Convention Center. And it has been 4 lanes, 2 in each direction. And they decided a road diet was in order, much as y'all have recently executed, and reduced it to 1 lane in each direction. Well, with only having 1 lane in each direction, that meant that shuttle buses, tour buses, taxis, TNCs like Uber and Lyft could not stop in the lane for unloading and loading at the facility, right? And so they've taken this space, which is under the US 90 West Bank Expressway, and they've consolidated all that transportation logistic craziness. So if there's going to have to be 20, they get conferences here of 30,000 people. If you have dozens of buses have to be somewhere. You've got all these TNCs and taxis dropping people off. Instead of having that all along the corridor, they've clustered those sort of undesirable uses in a way. In this one place, nobody has to see it, and it doesn't confound the rest of the system, and then they walk right across into the convention center. This is an example of a pretty conventional approach to making use of the space for public benefit. And this is actually an example of it being sort of thought through. In the beginning, this was actually born out of the Claiborne Avenue design team report that was thinking about this facility and how it has bifurcated neighborhoods or otherwise, impeded their development. Rather straightforward little community center with some recreation underneath the structures where they have some parking and a play set, of course. So the play set then gets shade, which we all know is sweet in 2 or 3 of the months here. And then rain protection as well. So on a rainy day, it's a place to go. I know that we've had a lot of rain last week, and I was looking a place to go walk the dog where I could get out of the rain for a moment myself. And so was the dog. Here's another example of pretty much an aesthetics only improvements, but with the aesthetics comes the use, right? Because if you can attract people in there or just to pass through, so you can see some art on the Claiborne corridors. You can see that the space is not like been fully and robustly designed by a skilled team. They've got containers in there and parking and some nonsense, but they have managed to echo back significant heritage themes to the community, right? In terms of local activists, local musicians. Obviously, the musical heritage in Lafayette is deep. It has changed the world, echoing back some of that and some of the other elements of local heritage, is an easy exercise for local artists, right? And lots of opportunity to do so. Baton Rouge similarly has murals in many places, and you can visit the Walls Project online. What you see here's a screenshot that shows you the different dots that let you visit these different sites. And in some cases, it's simple geometric forms painted on columns, nothing complex. In some cases, I think there's LSU basketball heroes of yore painted on some of these. And in many cases, not meant to fully activate the space, but at least make it more attractive for those who have to walk through it or to drive through it. A couple more things you can visit in Baton Rouge. This is Expressway Park underneath 10 and 110. And as you can see, there are bike and pedestrian pathways running underneath this, and it's part of a larger system I'll show you. But there's also some play sets, and I think that more recently there's been the construction of one of those sort of outdoor gyms where you may have seen those resistance machines that are really fun to get on and figure out. I want to show you this additional slide because it ties it into the upcoming work. So there's quite a greenway system proposed in Baton Rouge. It's not all under the structure, but elements of it are. And I think that, that has relevance for Lafayette because we might put some bike ped connections under the structure, but obviously it needs to stitch to the rest of the network. We don't just want to run people back and forth underneath there without it being, the origins and destinations being different neighborhoods and then being able to connect those. So this work is ongoing in Baton Rouge. The I-10 widening project is going to further enhance some of these, and there'll be a little bit more of this coming up, and Anthony will touch on some of the specifics related there too. But I think that's great because the I-10 widening project is moving out ahead of us. It's already been well funded with the creative Garvey bonding that the state did. And they're wrestling through these issues of understructure use and context sensitive improvements. And so it's nice to be able to follow and learn from what they are doing. I think that's the end of my slides, and I should stop and yield to Anthony. Take the rest of the way.
Can we ask one more question? I see one from Tina.
Yeah, I'd love to take one from Tina.
So has there been any progress on the request made by Macomb Bizet on our view from the community house and what we may experience vision, noise, etc. wise?
Yes, we'll have something relatively soon. We're still working on the design. So it's hard to, just quickly generate a rendering for you because we're still debating about this or that and the height, right? As Matthew was saying. So, but nonetheless, we didn't want to deny you. So we've developed a rendering. We're still putting some annotation on it based on the most recent design work. And the sneak peek of what you'll see is from the community house is very, very little. From the porch, there's a bend in 12th Street, so you can't just stand on the porch and see the new interstate exactly. But if you walked out into 12th and down 100 feet and look down 12th, you'd barely be able to see it sort of behind a tree. But we'll send you a file. I think beginning of next week probably that would show that.
Okay, thank you for that. And it's more so the community house was a point that I knew that I can tell you guys where I wanted you to give me a look from, a point of reference for you guys. But it's really for us to be able to have a better conversation with people in our community, because I hear that y'all are getting feedback from people from across the community about heights and decorations and designs and everything else. But I don't think any of that has come from people from my community. And having that information will be a lot easier for me to have those types of conversations with people in my neighborhood because we're actively doing those things. So I'd like to just be able to have a little bit more information so that, our voices are being heard in this process, or that I at least have some level of confidence that they are being heard. Because I hear y'all saying that y'all have talked to a lot of people, but I mean, nobody's talked to me other than Deidre. So I'm just concerned. And you don't have to talk to me. It's just, I don't think that's coming from my community. So I want to make sure that we're getting our voices in there as well.
Tina, this is Jennifer with BBR. I'm actually the one who took the pictures from the street in front of the community house. And I wasn't able to take it from the porch. There were some vehicles in the road itself that were kind of blocking the view. But if you have a preference for where you would like the viewpoint, I'll email you tomorrow and maybe we can get together and I can go back and take some pictures kind of based on where you would like them specifically, so we can make sure we're getting you exactly the viewpoint that you want.
Okay. If you can shoot me your email, we can reach out that way.
That'd be perfect. Okay. Thanks, Tina.
And it won't be the only visualization you get to see. We're going to produce, once we know what we're building a little bit better than we do now, because we don't want to produce, 4 versions and 2 options for every view. You know what I mean? It's just, we don't have enough certainty now, but we'll produce lots of renderings that will show it from specifically historic neighborhoods, all the neighborhoods, up close from further back. So we want everybody to be able to really have this conversation with folks in the neighborhood. And we haven't really engaged with y'all yet, partly because of COVID. So we're eager to, and we would have hoped that neighborhood meetings were going on concurrent with these LCAG meetings. So, we're still trying to figure out, are we 2 or 8 months from the end of lockdown? Should we pivot and start to just think about mailers and electronic surveys, or still just push for in-person stuff? I know Deidre thinks about it just about every day of her life and is super motivated to get us out there and talking to y'all. We just haven't really figured out the best means to do so yet.
Yeah. And just so y'all know, height is a concern for us. And what I'm looking at is the height and also the lighting of the structure. Because depending on how high it is, the one thing I don't want to see is it look like there's a Saints game happening 2 blocks from me every night, or the noise and everything that goes along with that. So I think it's something that'll help with our conversations, because that is something that comes up often about the noise and the traffic and what's happening around that structure. Understand that we don't exactly know what it looks like, but I think we've made enough decisions to where we can kind of make some informed guesses and just start trying to inform us a little bit more. So that's all I'm asking, just for the information that I need to be better informed when I speak to people in my community about what's going on with this project.
I don't know, Deidre, if you have anything you want to add in that regard, or should we just keep rolling here?
Would it help if I took myself off mute? No, I just wanted to add to that conversation again. We have started some talks with some of the organizations around town, but we are trying to figure out the best way to interact with the neighborhoods because, of course, these are going to be bigger groups, and we want to make sure that we are hearing everyone's voices because the neighborhoods, you all are the ones, you all live in these areas. A lot of you all work in these areas, and you're in these areas a lot more often than some of the other agencies that we've reached out to. So we're just trying to figure out what is the best way that we can get quality interaction with you all, but at the same time, keep everybody safe.
Okay. Moving on to the next section.
Okay, so I am going to switch over. So I will share my screen, if I may, and then it'll just take me 1 second to click over to this. And then just let me know if you can see, it's just 1 second here. Can you see that section 5 slide?
Looks
Yes, we
good.
can.
Great, okay. So there's 2 sections left, and this section we can go through rather briefly, but it's essentially just tailored to take everything we've just been talking about, and some of this stuff has already come up tonight. So it's a good moment to recap that. To just all the things that we're going to take into consideration and that you all should take into consideration as we advance forward. So, you know, we've been talking about costs, like who pays for what and what's eligible to be paid for under which funds. Is there a market demand for some of this stuff? So for example, some of those competing interests that we referenced earlier, you know, we don't want to be proposing something here that might already be somewhere else or that might be planned for somewhere else. That goes along with public need and, you know, the actual design and the style and all of this stuff has kind of come to the surface by having this dialogue and by hearing from both this group, neighborhood residents, public at large, et cetera. And so we did create a couple more slides just to kind of go over some of this stuff. The long and short of it, the Federal Highway Administration funds are limited to transportation infrastructure, right? And so that's pretty cut and dry. That's clear. Transportation is more than just motorized vehicles, though. I mean, bicycle and pedestrian facilities also fall under the guise of transportation infrastructure. So that's one of those things where as we advance, we can start to better assess, well, what can be paid for? And I know we were talking about lighting earlier. It'll come down to lighting that's associated with a bicycle or pedestrian piece of infrastructure, as well as the highway itself, would be eligible. And so that's why those questions will kind of be fleshed out as guidelines begin to materialize. The facilities that are not transportation related would have to be funded by other sources, and we can get into that discussion with you as we advance through these slides. DOTD does permit other uses below the infrastructure through a joint use process. So the things that we've been showing you tonight are possible. They don't necessarily have to be as glamorous or as robust or as intricate as some of the things that have been done in bigger cities or other places, but it's all within the realm of possibility if it's right-sized and logical and makes sense for Lafayette. And again, we'll talk about, you know, with you directly what you think is needed. And again, that'll just be one part of our analysis of, you know, talking with other neighborhoods, other stakeholders to see what makes sense. This chart is really just a fancy way of going through some of the things we were just talking about, what can be paid for under federal funds, what can be paid for under other funds. And so again, if it's lighting or even amenities in the streetscape like benches and trash cans that are associated with a bike facility or a pedestrian facility, they're eligible to be paid for under these funds. But certainly programmatic uses that have nothing to do with transportation, such as a playground or a skate park or other things, would have to be paid for by other means. There's things that kind of like land in between, like for example, shade structures, lighting, as we said, is another one of those things, signage and wayfinding elements. those could again be paid for through a hybrid process where if those elements that are associated with a transportation structure or facility, those can be paid for under these funds versus some of the ones that may land elsewhere, and those would have to be paid for differently. So it really is kind of a complex mix that will get sorted out, but that's why it's hard to know exactly until final, recommendations are made, what can be paid for by what, if that helps. Again, like all the things that we want to consider as we're looking at what might make sense under this structure, the fact that it does provide shade and cover from the rain, that might actually be a benefit and not a hindrance. But then you do have the noise associated with traffic kind of roaring up ahead, overhead. And so finding the right use that works with that is part of the process. Keeping into account that these facilities will have to be accessible and have to be maintained and easily accessed by those that will be maintaining it. All those things will come into play. I think what we want to do is just shift to this last segment, which is taking everything we've talked about tonight so far, all the precedents that you've seen in other communities, some of the issues and funding conversations that we've been having, and now start to apply it to Lafayette. Now, the big preface to this is we haven't designed anything because this is just the beginning of the process. In fact, the real true design process for this kind of thing, under use programming, hasn't really begun. This is all what I would consider to be part of the analysis process, right? So this is looking at existing conditions. This is analyzing what's there and getting your input as part of that analysis. But what we thought might be helpful is if we started to just look at the corridor as opposed to taking you to international examples only, national examples only, or even local examples only. But now let's see what might fit here and start to flesh this out. So what we did was we looked at the overall corridor and keep in mind that the final geometry of the corridor is still in flux, and that's going to be massaged and refined based on input from this group and others as we go forward. But the overall corridor, as you see it here at this swath, is more or less, fairly defined, right? But it's, think of it as a brush stroke. But what this image is showing you is where you see the orange. What we're trying to highlight in the orange is the portions of the corridor that are indeed elevated. So the area at Khalees Saloon, where that interchange occurs, there are these elevated components before it comes back down to grade going south. There's this segment at grade, albeit there's a bridge that goes over the river here, and then it becomes elevated again. And that elevated section that's in the central part of the corridor skirts all of these neighborhoods, Macomb Vizay and Freetown, Puerto Rico, the downtown core, Laplace and Sterling Grove. It'll kind of like hug all of this. And I know that connectivity is going to be a big part of this conversation going forward. And the fact that we want to ensure that this is not a divide, that there is opportunity below to make sure that there is connectivity. And that is part of programming the underused structure. So I think that's relevant. And then we kind of saw there's a real transition to then the area around Willow and that corridor where it kind of goes under the elevated. And that what it starts to show us is that there are these sub areas that might have different characters, and there might be different uses that are better suited to, let's say, this area where Khalees Saloon meets the main line versus where you're adjacent to dense residential neighborhoods in downtown. That would have a whole different maybe demand for potential use. And then, where the Willow Street corridor comes in, that's a totally different character, and is somewhat of a gateway from the north. We talked a little bit about gateways at the last workshop, and Khalees Saloon kind of being a gateway from the south, but then this downtown core and the neighborhoods around it, very different character. And so it's helping us as the design team compartmentalize the different areas that might demand different programmatic uses. And so what we did was we just wanted to take one little piece of it. So we've done this for 2 different areas. And again, this is just to kind of get the conversation going. But if you look at this area here, which is adjacent to downtown, we've turned it so it's looking kind of linear this way. But one of the things, and again, where you see all these white dots on the orange, that's meant to be the piers that support the elevated structure. So again, the orange swath is the elevated structure, these white dots being the support piers. I know we talked a little bit about the piers during workshop 2, and the idea, and again, this is all going to be dependent upon which structure type is determined to be used and all that kind of thing. But as of now, we're looking to have relatively uniform 150 feet in between piers. But there may be some moments, and this is one of those moments where there is the potential for the span to be somewhat greater. And I know that, again, during workshop 2, we talked about the potential kind of signature element that might span Johnston. And so there's a potential that in this area, you don't have the 150 feet between piers, but you have a much greater area. And that's meaningful to what you can do underneath it. So that's why we're pointing out this zone. But we also know that, 6th Street and Jefferson and Johnston are all kind of main spines that will feed into downtown and the neighborhoods on the other side of the main line as well. And so this seems a significant area. So what basically happens is with these piers set 150 feet apart, it naturally creates these sub areas or sections that we've numbered here, just so that we can start to look at how do you program this? And, there might be different programming for each of these sections. There may be only some that are logically programmed. Keep in mind that like a street like 6th Street will remain a through street. So part of the programming of this is the fact that you have a street that carries cars and has pedestrian accommodation on the other side of it as part of it. But anyway, it's starting to compartmentalize these rooms. And so if we took one of these spaces, like this space that's sub area number 2 or section 2, again, we're not trying to say that these are the uses that are right for section 2. It's just saying this is, looking at some of the precedents and all the potential ideas for maybe active recreational use close to the downtown core or not. This is what can kind of fit into one of these sub areas. And it really can run the gamut of options. And so there could be a mix of active recreation use. There could be priority given to one kind of active recreation use. It could be determined that there's no need for active recreation under this overhead. And in fact, it's better suited for passive recreation or gathering or art installations. So this is really, again, just to start to show people how things might fit into these kind of compartmentalized spaces. But none of this has been predetermined. And if I look at another area within the same sub area, again, this is the idea that you don't necessarily have to look at these as individual compartments, but rather a series of them could be strung together. So for example, the space between 6th Street and Jefferson, where there's kind of these 4 sub areas that are created through the pier placement, there could be programmatic uses that are woven through there. And it remains to be seen whether the community wants a skate park or whether the community thinks they need sports fields or other active use courts like a basketball court or a tennis court or anything like that. But the idea is that some of these spaces could be flexible use. So the idea of that along 6th Street here, this is being shown that maybe it's conceptualized as a plaza space. And so what does that really mean? It means that most of the time it can be open space, but it has a flexible use. So it could give way to a farmer's market on the weekends or certain days during the week. It could be a flea market that's once a month or semi-annual, it could be a festival site when that is warranted or makes sense, or if it overflow space. But the rest of the time, maybe it's a seating area, maybe it's an art installation. And so some of these spaces could be a number of things all at once. And so what we tried to do again, not trying to say that it's got to be one thing or another. This is just to give visuals that kind of go along with this menu of options of what do these spaces look like? And the idea that all of this stuff can occur under an overhead structure. And in fact, some of these things can occur in tandem. So it doesn't have to be either or, well, all right, we'll take a skate plaza, but then we can't have art space. That's not the case. You know, it could be all or any of these things or none of them, right? So this is really just to kind of get people thinking about what might be. And then we wanted to look at the other ends too. So from the original slide that looked at the overall corridor, you know, I'd mentioned there are these kind of gateway sub areas, if you will. So there's the one at Khalees Saloon where that corridor kind of merges with and interfaces with the main line. And then there is the other sub area at the north where Willow Street runs under the overhead. And so again, similar kind of thing, the idea that these 150-foot typical pier spacings create these compartments, still want to maintain through movement and accommodations for connectivity, but then how do we start to populate that? And so we just wanted to kind of go a different route and say, all right, it doesn't have to be necessarily active recreation, or it doesn't have to be festival space, but it could be other things too. And the idea that the underuse could be made useful via other things like stormwater management areas or naturalized landscape, but that there's still potential for flexible use. And one of the things that we just kind of started to look at Willow Street is the idea that, you know, we were talking about landscape treatments earlier this evening, and the idea that, you know, there are different landscape treatments that are low maintenance, but still appealing. For example, a meadow-like or a prairie-like landscape that also is kind of a sponge that can soak up water, right? So stormwater, but still be attractive, that there's potential to have trails, multi-purpose trails that are, you know, essentially transportation, infrastructure components that are woven throughout. But it becomes more park-like. So this is an option that's intended to just kind of like start to consider some passive type of use, passive recreation, and that some of this space that's in between and around the elevated, because there is right of way that will be on either side of the elevated. So it's not just the structure itself alone, but there's also space on either side. And what do we do with that space? And it doesn't have to be mowed lawn. It doesn't have to be concrete, but it could be some kind of a meadow-like or naturalized landscape that is habitat, that helps with stormwater management, that's aesthetically appealing. And then there could be trails that kind of run through it. And so you can kind of see some of that here. But again, I think the key is none of this has been predetermined. And this is us just taking a very early diagrammatic approach to what might fit and what might make sense. But we still have a lot to learn from other things that are going on in the community. We want to hear from you. We want to hear from others. And so we do have time left tonight to have kind of an open discussion at this point for the amount of time that we have left. But there is a second part to this workshop, and that will be in early January. And that second half of this workshop will be solely focused on input. So I know we've dropped a lot on you tonight. We do want to give you some time right now to give us some initial feedback. But the other hope is that we're going to continue to listen and reach out to folks. And then over the holidays and into the new year, it'll give you guys some time to consider everything we talked about tonight, talk to others, talk to neighbors, talk to friends, talk to constituents. And then when we reconvene for the second half of this, we can have, I think, a much more involved dialogue and a conversation about everything we've shown you.
Great. Thank you, Anthony. It looks like if we can take a minute to answer some questions, I think that the presentation is wrapped up. So we'll go ahead and just read off some comments from Sam. Love the idea of employing native plants in lieu of mowed grass, especially for areas with no active program. Thank you for the comment. Let's see, from Charles, have the sites that are likely contaminated been evaluated for hazardous materials that may limit uses of the areas under the elevated sections? Obviously, no one would want their children playing in a playground with soils contaminated by lead and asbestos dust. What is the likelihood that runoff from the highway will carry hazardous materials that could contaminate the spaces under the connector? Does the projected air quality present any issues? Those are a lot that I just read. Let's see. Let me go ahead and find you. Okay, sorry about that. Okay,
Were we giving him a chance to further explain, or should we?
go ahead, Derek.
And I don't have all the answers. I'm just going to buy Tim some more time to think about it and get it. That's all I'm doing. This team, this consulting team is not in charge of that assessment of the hazardous materials. Obviously, we are very aware of the situation and we've talked about it numerous times before. I think that the analysis of the site is ongoing. Tim has a team managing that process. We will be thinking about it. We've already been thinking about it and how it influences what we're working on. And then you had mentioned, I think, the pollutants that would run off from highway stormwater and air quality. Were those the other two questions? I can't see it right now. Here we go. Yes. Highway runoff. There are some contaminants in typical roadway runoff, highway and local streets, both. You know, some of it is just what's in the air. Some of it is more specific to the vehicles, right? Brake pads and things like this. Those are, routinely managed with different water quality features, and I think that this state has really advanced in its ability to do so. It's pretty integral to a lot of the road projects now, or at least some consideration of which kind of features can help remove certain pollutants of concern from stormwater runoff. That will be something that, this team is familiar with, and eventually we'll get to that part of the conversation much further into design. Air quality is obviously a conversation all in and of itself. We won't get too far with that today. Most of the air quality analyses are sort of community in nature, right? There is not something that FHWA typically does different for the immediate space of the highway. The air quality analysis is looking at the pollutants of concern in the air nationally, and we'll look at the effect that this project has, which will, I foresee, likely an improvement, but I can't say that for sure. We haven't done the analysis yet, but I'd say that from the previous jobs I've done, we never found that the air was somehow worse for you immediately at the highway than it is elsewhere. There's some, argument in the literature perhaps, but not within the official air quality analyses that we do routinely for FHWA don't really show that as a major concern. I didn't say much about hazardous materials, which is a giant issue that will influence all of this. Tim might want to share more on that if he has it. I know we are still in the analysis phase, but Tim? Maybe you're still with us? I think you are.
Maybe Noel.
Yeah, my question on the hazardous materials is basically, concern as we plan underneath these highways. The record decision previously only required the site. It didn't evaluate it in the record decision. It said that it would in the future, and there would be remediation as necessary, and that remediation would only improve the site to industrial levels. So if it's only going to be improved to industrial levels, are we trying to get that strengthened in this record of decision, supplemental record of decision, and or parks appropriate in industrial in levels that have only been remediated to industrial levels?
Regarding hazardous materials, I would leave that up to Noel to answer. That's not really, that's more of environmental specific.
Have a discussion on the hazardous sites that we find out there. And as far as I know, we are, if we do have to remediate a site, we do remediate to industrial standards. And we're not, that's what our road is for. If you have an underuse that isn't compatible, it will likely not be able to get a joint use agreement.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, some other comments from Sam. I'm glad to know that bike and walking trails are more of a possibility for federal support. Does the frontage road plan currently use the existing Evangeline corridor between Johnson and 2nd Street?
Off the hip, I don't have an answer for you, but I can tell you that we will soon have all sorts of very detailed drawings of every little thing in that regard. But we don't for tonight. There's still some traffic analyses. These are complex, giant models that tell us things. Then we go back and fix things. Then we model it again, and we're still iteratively moving through that. So someone else might have more certainty about the frontage road. Otherwise, my answer would just be stay tuned.
Yeah, and I do know that one of our upcoming workshops, if it's not workshop 4, it'll likely be workshop 5, will be very much focused on both what the Evangeline corridor could look like after the main line is constructed, but also focus on bicycle and pedestrian connectivity. So that is something that we had hoped to actually talk about that earlier on in this series. Initially, we were going to talk about that now as workshop 3, but as we're waiting for some of the traffic analysis, updated traffic analysis to wrap up, which is important, we've kind of pushed that topic back, but that will be a primary focus at one of the upcoming workshops, and we'll be able to get into much more detail about it. But I think for tonight's focus, we wanted to kind of just mention it because you can't really talk about what to do under the structure without talking about connectivity. But we'll talk about more of the network of connectivity, I think, in much greater detail in the future.
Okay.
You'll see just my following comment is directly related to that, so I'll just go ahead and mention it. But I think that, if the frontage roads do end up following Evangeline, I like how that creates a large section of raised highway that wouldn't be bounded completely by frontage roads. And, as you think about that stretch that really faces downtown Lafayette and a little bit of Freetown, Puerto Rico, and how that really might expand the ability to have programming underneath, especially between, that site and the railroad track. And I'm very interested in that as being an area of active programming, because it has just much more potential if it's not just a space underneath a bridge bounded by 2 more busy highways, essentially.
And there would be a large segment of it that's not going to be confounded with spaghetti, ramps on both sides. So there, I don't, exactly where things are touching down. I can't show you right now, but and I don't know myself, but there will be a large area that is sort of, as you are visualizing it right now, very wide open. Folks on one side look completely through to the other side, and aren't crossing a lot of traffic to pass through the space.
Right, and I'm talking about essentially the space, north of the orange line here, between that and you see the Rosa Parks Center, kind of top center right.
Yeah, and I think it's valid to say that a lot of the conversation about what to do under here has implications when it comes to then what might later happen here. And while this isn't the subject of our focus for the work associated with the I-49 project, it's important to the community, and so we want to make sound recommendations for here that then incentivize or encourage potential future uses of the adjacent area.
Yeah, I think that's the context we're being sensitive to.
Okay, from Brett Millington, can we start thinking about zoning overlay districts to prevent billboard and visually unappealing structures, et cetera?
That is interesting. You know, I think that one of the topics we haven't addressed a whole lot, but we know is important, is not just the area that's completely under DOTD control, but how it interfaces with the areas on both sides, right? How this project stimulates development, leaves parcelization that makes some sense for development, and how that development works with the space underneath and the aesthetics of all that, right? Which certainly will include billboards. Now, part of that is a local question, you know, about signage, and is going to be bound up in the local code, and part of it is a matter of.
This is Deidre. I'm gonna interrupt you real quick. Hey,
Please.
Brett. I spoke with our program specialist at DOTD who oversees, you know, our billboard regulations statewide, and I spoke with Ann today. So one of the things that was very interesting is, of course, DOTD, we don't permit billboards to be erected within state right of way. And actually, one of the things that was really interesting is that the local government can have a moratorium if they want to prevent billboards from being erected along the corridor of the connector.
Yeah, you know, one of the issues I know nationwide has been the different states and the federal government maybe don't allow it within the right of way, but someone can go 10 yards away from the right of way and put up a 150-foot billboard that sticks up in, you know, sticks up above the roadway, and it would destroy any aesthetics that we're trying to do here. You know, if we want to put a plaza out and it's got a big billboard sticking up in front of it, well then, you know, what have we done? You know, so I guess this conversation obviously has to be done on the local level outside of the right of way, and what we allow within, say, 300 yards on either side. Certainly want to be sensitive to Macomb Visa. I don't think they want that either. And you know, so it's just something I think all of us that are in this group need to start thinking about, and maybe having those conversations with the council and some other people. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Let's see. Matthew Holland, what kind of input are you guys looking for from us before our next meeting? Many of the examples given today would be the financial responsibility of the city or parish and seem outside of the scope of the initial construction from DOTD. What can DOTD contribute under structure uses other than changes to the structure height and spacing piers? Let me unmute you, Matthew.
You know, I think some of the things that, you know, we're looking to hear the next time after everybody's had some time to think about it and talk to others is what makes sense for Lafayette. And, you know, when we put this together, I think, as I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, looking at precedents is an obvious place to start. Through hearing from others and starting to do some other outreach, you know, we've been talking to different groups. There's going to be groups in the future that we have side conversations with as we want to engage the different neighborhoods and talk to different folks. We're starting to get a stronger sense that, you know, there's a lot of fundamental things that people are concerned about, and they want to ensure that this corridor is safe and well lit and connected, but at the same time, they want to make sure it's right sized and fundable and maintainable, and not going to be a burden, right? And so that's helping us because it helps us to right size the things that we're looking at. And so I think it's going to push us to be a little bit more creative with both our approaches to make them more flexible use, to make them maybe less expensive to install and maintain. And then also be creative with the funding sources and what can we, to try to get as much of it paid for, associated with transportation facilities as possible. And so there's a whole lot of different ways we can approach it to make best of that situation. But to answer the question, which is, well, what do we want to hear from you on? It's really like, what do you really want to see here? What do you think the community is lacking? What do you think would work well here? And what would be able to be implemented that will set up the adjacent parcels for future success down the road? Because while we are not in control of what happens on the adjacent parcels, I think everybody wants to see a density emerge, especially adjacent to the downtown core, that is appropriate and walkable and attractive. And so while we can't necessarily shape what that will be, that'll be for developers and others to figure out. We can kind of set a groundwork that can be built upon. And so I think that's why we kind of want to hear from this group and others on what would be a logical next step.
Matthew, did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you so much. Sorry, I don't have any follow-up to it. Thanks.
Okay, Sam, I think you already spoke to this maybe, but I'll just read it. I know we mentioned that the Shreveport style underbridge program could be complementary to adjacent businesses. How are we thinking about the frontage roads running through the urban areas as sites to encourage future development?
I think there's a lot of talk to be had about the adjacent development. We'd have to clarify some frontage road language, right? So there's some ramps that are going to serve the interstate, right? And collector distributor facilities that's kind of a ramp. Those are going to have controlled access, right? They're not going to be something that have adjacent businesses and such. Obviously, we have a very different circumstance with the couplet or the boulevard that the thruway turn into. And then there's other streets, right? Other local streets that are part of the immediate sort of area one around the interstate. So there'll be a lot of talk about how those adjacent properties work with the property underneath. And what we want to do is encourage y'all to think about that as well. You don't always need us in the room, but we are here to facilitate that conversation. And we think that the conversation that we're trying to cultivate here is not just about direction to us. At some point, you do have to tell us what to design, and we will do that. But it's also a conversation among yourselves about how this really works. And do you want a lot of new development, or do you want this to push people into existing developed areas, right? And if there's new development, what's that look like, and how does it relate to the space underneath? And I think, there's lots of ways that happens. Parking is not a big part of that Red River District project in Shreveport, but I think parking gives you a good example of the interplay because, for example, if you had uses under the structure, large festival attraction, kind of events, then folks are going to have to park somewhere. They're going to end up parking in the existing on and off street system, right? Or you reverse that and imagine that the parking is actually under the structure, in which case the adjacent commercial properties could then have a minimum parking requirements removed, which would incentivize development. They could have higher floor area ratios. They wouldn't have parking in front of their businesses and such, and it would contribute to a more urban form. So I think, parking is just one of the many elements to be discussed here, but it does give you an example of how you can either put the use under the structure and park elsewhere, or you can put the uses next to the structure, park under the structure. And, that's And that's just for one place, right? This is a 3.5 mile corridor. There will be lots of nodes with very different approaches to how the space is used.
And I guess my comment would be, I don't think it is a question of whether or not people would like development along the corridor, because I think development has been forestalled along the corridor for the past couple of decades, basically because of this project. So the question is, what does equitable development look like on the corridor with this project? To Tina's point too.
Thank you. Okay, we have just about 10 minutes left. I'm gonna keep going through. Noelle, I think this one's for you. Just to follow up, I think, from Charles's last question. So if the sites are believed to be contaminated or remediated, they will only be remediated to industrial levels. At what point will we know if uses preferred by LCAG will be permissible in those areas? Will these sites be evaluated before the SEIS and SROD are completed?
Okay, this is Noelle. Will these sites be evaluated before the SEIS and SROD are completed? We're in the process right now of preparing the SEIS, and we'll look at the hazardous waste sites and do an evaluation on them. So I'm assuming that's what you're talking about. So yes, we will look at those and do an evaluation. Sometimes we do additional tests after our environmental documents.
Well, I guess my question is, the previous EIS and record of decision specifically said that the rail yard, for instance, would in the future need to be evaluated to determine what remediation it would need. So my question is, will this supplemental EIS have an answer of what remediation will be needed prior to the supplemental record of decision, or will that be kicked until after we determine whether or not we have a preferred alternative selected through this current CSS process, and whether or not the recommendations coming out of LCAG will have the opportunity to comment on our preferred mitigation and programming underneath these structures based on whether or not remediation will be required, what level of remediation will be done, and whether or not it's even possible to make it to a standard that would allow for the programming that we desire in these areas.
Okay, now that I know you're talking about the railroad site, we are in the process of evaluating that particular site.
Well, the railroad site, but also, you know, this area was developed a very long time ago. It's had a highway running through it for a very long time. So lead contamination in the soil is probably very likely. You know, so the railroad site, in addition to these others, just throughout the whole corridor, but mainly because it's such a big portion of the viaduct area that we're talking about now, was my main concern, but generally throughout the area. But so the railroad site, we should have an answer before we make our recommendations.
We are looking at that one right now. Some of the other sites, when we do an environmental, we identify sites that have potential. We don't always test them before the environmental, but we'll do it, you know, later in the process. But the railroad, we are definitely evaluating at the moment.
Okay, so we will know that before we make our recommendations, the LCAG should have some idea of what remediation will be necessary and possible and done under this project before we make our recommendations.
I don't know what you're talking about by your recommendation. I mean, we'll know.
So in January, for instance, in January, the second half of this number 3 workshop, y'all are asking for feedback from the LCAG regarding programming we would like to see. If that programming isn't possible based on contamination under the sites, I'd like to know that before I make a recommendation on what I'd like to see underneath the site.
You won't know by January.
Okay, will we know before, when would we know to be able to adjust our recommendations? Will the LCAG have an opportunity to adjust our recommendations based on the site evaluation of the rail yard?
Okay, so you're not limited. We're asking for input specific to underuse activities, but this whole CSS process is going to include quite a few workshops and public involvement, and so there'll be other opportunities.
Yeah.
Not limited to that day in January. You can give us your input throughout the process.
Well, I understand that, but I guess what I'm asking is, will the LCAG wrap up before or after we have an answer on the site evaluation of the rail yard?
I can't answer that right now because I'm not sure how long. I don't have a schedule in front of me how long it takes to do the testing as compared to the LCAG workshops. I don't have an answer for that. We're doing this part of the SEIS process, so you definitely have an opportunity to comment.
Okay, so if the LCAG comes out with recommendations for programming underneath underneath the viaduct, but on top of the current rail yard,
right?
Those recommendations may be based on faulty assumptions because we don't know whether or not the remediation will be possible.
Those recommendations will be made.
Based on information that you have, and if that information changes, then you can check. I mean, then what we have to do there will change. I mean,
but for instance, a playground in an industrial site doesn't seem to me like. I mean, when I hear industrial, I don't think children playing in a playground. So if we say we'd like to see a greenway with intermittent playgrounds underneath the viaducts, that may not be possible based on what you're telling me is the remediation will only need to be completed to the level of industrial, because that's what a highway is. So anything underneath that we as a community, we as LCAG may decide as programming may not even be possible based on what DOTD is recommending or based on the level of remediation DOTD will do.
It's definitely an iterative process, right? Where we're going to know more about hazmat, traffic, and other things, and your input, right? So some of the suggestions could be conditional, obviously, but also I'd say, we're not going to find out that this entire area, well, I suspect we won't find out this entire area is sort of hands off. You can't do anything with any of it, hazmat wise, right? So there's going to be different places, different levels. Let me finish, Charles.
I think we likely will find
different places that have different levels of contamination and different levels and different suggestions on the remediation. Some sites you can walk across, but not stay on. Some sites you can stay on without remediating. Some things need to be remediated, and it's just, it's complex, and we're not there yet, but we will be.
Right.
And obviously,
that's my
we won't
question.
set in stone any master plan here before we have those data.
And then joint use agreements can be proposed at any time, even after the structure's completed.
But the record of decision will have certain commitments in it based on the joint use agreements that are proposed prior to the record of decision. So if the record of decision,
it may or may not joint use agreement.
The previous one did, I guess. The previous one did, at least.
It may or may not. That's what we're working out right now.
Okay, so it might not. The recommendations for programming underneath might not even be included in the supplemental record of decision.
It just depends on what the outcome of all this process is.
So the outcome of the LCAG's recommendations will always be subject to the outcome of a process that's taking place parallel and concurrently that we may or may not be privy to the results of before we make our recommendation.
I'm not sure what
I think your recommendation comes in waves, right? You're giving us a little input now. We're going to get more in January. We're not going to stop talking to y'all, the neighborhoods, agencies. There's a 106 process related to this same thing. So we're going to keep talking. And if what we're hearing now is you like, recreational uses X and Y in generally these 2 or 3 locations. We can start to put rough sketch ideas together. Then hazmat data is going to come in. Those rough sketches are going to change. Then you're going to see it and say, no, that's not what we want. Move that to the east, and it's going to change again. So, you know, we're rolling up our sleeves and we are in it now. And if I could draw a circle on the map right now that just said we're just going to avoid this spot, we sure would to make it easier. But it's not.
I would appreciate it if y'all would do that. To be honest,
yes.
If there's
we know where
likely
that
contaminated sites, if there's likely contaminated sites that will only be remediated to industrial levels, I would appreciate knowing where those sites are in the renderings that y'all present to us, so we know within a ballpark of what we're even imagining to happen at the site.
Yes, sir.
I mean, that only seems logical. You wouldn't say, do you want a playground right here, if you guys know that a playground would never be possible right there.
Right. If we knew now, we'd tell you more, but it's coming. Obviously, where we put columns into the ground and where we have stormwater, or even lay a foundation for a multi-use path that's going to trigger this question. So, but I do see we're at 6, and we failed to get to a couple questions. So this one, Charles, will be a subject of lots of conversation. Noelle, do you want to close us out on hazmat?
In what respect?
I just know, I thought you were chiming in. I thought you might have.
I have something to say, Tim Nickel. Remember, all this is just input. I mean, there's a lot of movable variables. So we're asking for input. We're not asking for perfect answers, or every single thing that every single person comes up with will be implemented and placed on here and everything will be perfect. We're not saying that. It's input. It's input that will be considered along the process with the development and construction and design of this future project for the community. So remember, it's input. There's other factors other than just contamination. There's many other factors. So remember, it's input.
Thank you. I do want to get to the last 2. I know we're over, but I definitely want to get to Matthew's question about what are the federal funding possibilities for bike ped pathways. Are there any examples you guys can cite where that has been done before? Can we get a quick answer on that?
In many cases, those are transportation functions that are built into the program. And you can look at the I-10 widening project, the construction management at risk, as they're rolling out designs throughout that corridor. There's some bike ped improvements that are sort of part of it and that are funded. But there are some upper limits to it, right? You can really gold plate some multi-use pathway facilities. You can also sort of under design them and they're not wide enough or thought out well enough. And there's also, there's lots of options for us, right? There's the local bike ped network we have to tie into. There's sort of recreational pathways underneath the expressway that folks will want, on a Saturday afternoon, but there's also a bike commute function we want to think about, and maybe that pushes bike ped activity more towards the throughway and less about the green space underneath the structure. So partly depends on what we come up with as a recommendation, but FHWA and DOTD both have, are very supportive with making sure their projects are complete for all traveling motorists traveling all different ways. I shouldn't say motorists, traveling people.
Thank you, Derek. I kind of missed the part where you had shown this this table before, and I saw that Sam had mentioned the federal possibility of federal funding, so I just wanted some more information on that. Thank you.
Okay, and then Tina, very interested in how pedestrian uses will be mitigated under this proposed structure. Concerned about the barrier that the frontage road creates to folks from Macomb Visa accessing those areas safely with 4 lanes now. Equitable development is very important to Macomb Visa. I don't know if you want to add anything else, Tina.
I don't think I need to add, for the sake of time, I don't think I need to add any more, because I think hopefully we're gonna jump back into this in January and keep this conversation going. Yeah, there's a lot of talk about what's happening in the development underneath the structure and adjacent to the structure, but looking at the alignment, there isn't much like anything programmable safely that I see so far from Macomb Vise, and I could be mistaken. But we are a limited income, limited transportation community. So pedestrian walkable areas are important, at least to me and definitely to the community. But I'm not seeing how we actually get that. Like I don't see that just yet. So definitely interested in keeping those conversations going and making sure that the uses underneath this are the things that are being proposed are things that people in my neighborhood can actually use.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how many people use skate parks, but maybe we might even entertain a dog park at this point. You know, dogs still need some place to crap. So.
And even just hearing like that comment will help us, I think, shape the conversation we can have as part of part 2 in January, because there's been a lot of emphasis on pedestrian connectivity and also uses that are not just downtown centric, but adjacent to residential neighborhoods. I think that's a really great place to close out, because it's helping us now know what's important to you and what we should be prioritizing for the next round of this conversation. And so that'll allow us to come back to this group in January, better sense of what you guys want to talk about, and hopefully have some more specific answers for you at that point. And then just have an open dialogue.
I know we're not showing a lot of line work, but we will. And you're not going to be cut off from this facility. The Macomb Vise neighborhood is not going to see a lot of barriers there. I don't know, Tim, if you want to flesh out any of that, but you're going to see it's going to be stitched together really well, and you're not going to have this, as others have said, this divide is not going to be the divide that it is now.
Okay. And also just the emphasis, because Sam brought it up, but my comment about equitable development, I know it's something that we really hadn't talked about in too much detail along this corridor, but one of the reasons why Macomb Vise supported this particular design is because it allowed for us to be able to utilize more of our frontage road side for more business and commercial development along the corridor. So we'd like to be able to continue that work, but then also look at like what, not just Macomb Vise side, but across the entire corridor, what does equitable development across the north side actually look like? We understand that this is a project that's gonna be affecting the region. And we're looking at regional folks giving us opinions on these things, but these folks aren't living in this area. And we need to make sure that we're keeping that kind of at the forefront of that the people who are living here need to be able to utilize these spaces. So if we're looking at what a lot of the ideas that you guys have proposed, it sounds like we're about to have like one of the greatest linear parks ever in Lafayette. And I'd like for that to be one of the greatest linear parks that people in our community can actually utilize, and that they feel that it's not happening to them, but they're a part of what's happening in the whole process.
Yeah, and I think that makes all the sense in the world. And it's really why we were even reluctant to start to show the potential programming of the space, because again, I don't want to fill in any blanks for your neighborhood. And so I think in part 2 of this conversation in January, you will help us fill in some of these blanks where we were just kind of starting to conceptualize what fits. We want to put in here what fits for you. And so I think that will be the key focus of our talk in January.
And I know that these are kind of like limited to invitation only conversations, and it doesn't, y'all can't stop me from having a room full of people, but is it okay if we have like a room full of people or as safely as we can get it to actually like hear this discussion and actually be able to chime in real time?
Yeah, I think that the point, Tina, is for us to actually have these side conversations with you as well, though, with, the people in the neighborhood. So, I think that's going to be our next step, is to, if you feel comfortable, to have people in your living room, to have these Zoom meetings, or even potentially come to where you are, if it's safe enough to have these conversations. So we will be reaching out to do that for sure. I know we're a little over. I just want to read this last comment because I'm reading all the comments. In future renderings, please disclose locations that will likely have contamination that will limit uses. Any good faith process should not knowingly allow community participants to base their recommendations on faulty information. Thank you for your comment, Charles. It's all noted. Do you want to take us home, Derek?
No, I'm hoping Tim is going to do that.
Oh, well, let's go.
Okay, I like, so, you know, a lot of the comments we got, the interaction. I just want to say, you know, in between this time, be getting with your constituents and get some ideas what you'd like to see. You know, try not to get too hung up in the weeds of worrying about things. If you have something reasonable and practical, you know, get the input. Be ready to give it to us at the next meeting in January. We'd love to hear it. I guess that's my big thing. I mean, just now I know there's discussion of contamination or this or that, or just remember it's input. We want to get input from everybody. You know, DOTD, the community, FHWA. We're going to look at what everything is, you know, all the input we got and you know, suggestions and comments and try to weigh out what, you know, what can be done and how can we make it fit, and, you know, so like I said, just gather your thoughts, talk to your neighbors, you know, find out what you know, what your constituents, you know, ideas are, and be ready for that in January.
And thank you everybody for your time tonight, and happy holidays to the entire group, and we'll see you in the new year.
Thank you.
Happy holidays, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.